The first thing my daughter said when she climbed into my car that sunny Tuesday afternoon should have meant nothing. Instead, it made my hands tighten around the steering wheel so suddenly that the leather creaked beneath my fingers. She tossed her purple backpack onto the passenger side floor, clicked her seatbelt, and with the casual innocence only a 9-year-old could possess, told me that her new teacher knew me. I smiled at first, assuming she meant the teacher had seen my name on some school form, but then my daughter added something that erased the smile from my face. She said her teacher had stared at our family photograph during class, gone completely silent, and then asked how long I had been her father. For several seconds, the sounds of afternoon traffic seemed to disappear. The bright September sun poured through the windshield, children laughed on the sidewalk outside Brookfield Elementary, and parents waved to one another beneath the maple trees, but I barely noticed any of it. There was only one thought moving through my mind. There was only one woman from my past who could have looked at my photograph that way. And I hadn't seen her in 13 years. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change a life, if you believe people sometimes deserve second chances even after years of silence, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Lifeline Vibes. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the people we think we've lost forever are simply waiting on the other side of a door we were too afraid to open. My name is Callum Mercer, and at 36, I had built a life that looked much more stable from the outside than it actually felt from within. I owned a small architectural restoration company, lived in a modest house near the edge of town, and raised my daughter, Tessa, alone. Her mother had died from complications following an illness when Tessa was 4. Grief had not destroyed us dramatically, it had done something quieter and, in some ways, harder. It had become part of the furniture. It lived in the empty chair at breakfast, in the way Tessa sometimes watched other mothers brushing their daughters' hair after school, in the birthday cards I signed from both of us because I couldn't bear to leave one side blank. Over the years, I learned how to make lunches, braid hair badly, wash paint from school uniforms, attend dance recitals, and answer impossible questions about death without letting my own voice break. I had also learned how to avoid certain parts of my own history. There were streets I rarely drove down, songs I changed immediately on the radio, and one name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. Mara Voss. Tessa kept talking as we pulled away from the school. Her teacher's name was Ms. Voss. She taught 4th grade. She wore her dark hair shorter now. She had laughed when Tessa mentioned that I burned pancakes on Sundays. Apparently, she remembered that I had always been terrible in kitchens. That detail hit me harder than anything else. 13 years was a long time to remember the way somebody ruined pancakes. I asked Tessa, as casually as I could, what exactly her teacher had said about knowing me. Tessa shrugged and explained that during a class project about families, everyone had brought photographs from home. When Ms. Voss reached her desk and saw mine, she froze. Tessa said the teacher touched the edge of the photograph for a moment and looked almost sad before asking whether my name was Callum Mercer. When Tessa said yes, Ms. Voss smiled strangely and told her that she and I had once been very good friends. Very good friends. I almost laughed at how harmless those words sounded. Mara and I had been many things, but harmless had never been one of them. We met when we were 17. She was the girl who sat beneath the old sycamore tree behind our high school during lunch because she hated crowded cafeterias. I was the boy who eventually started sitting there too without asking permission. Mara was brilliant, sharp-tongued when nervous, stubborn about almost everything, and secretly sentimental in ways she worked hard to hide. She carried paperback novels filled with folded corners, drank terrible vending machine coffee, and once spent 3 weeks nursing an injured sparrow in a cardboard box because she couldn't stand the thought of leaving it on the roadside. We became best friends first. Then something shifted during our final year. I still remembered one bright spring afternoon when we had walked home through streets covered in white blossom petals, our shoulders brushing until neither of us pretended it was accidental anymore. We never officially called ourselves a couple at first. We didn't need to. Everyone else already knew. For 5 years, Mara was the person I imagined beside me whenever I pictured the future. We attended different colleges but stayed close. We drove hours to see each other, survived cheap apartments, uncertain careers, family arguments, and the ordinary difficulties that seem enormous when you're young. Then, at 23, I received an opportunity to work with a prestigious restoration firm across the country. I wanted to go. Mara had just accepted a teaching position near her mother, who was struggling financially after a divorce. She couldn't leave. What should have been a difficult conversation became a battlefield built from fear. I accused her of holding me back. She accused me of treating our relationship like something temporary. We said things young people say when love feels so certain that they mistakenly believe it can survive any cruelty. I left anyway. For the first few months, we tried long distance. Then phone calls became arguments, arguments became silence, and silence eventually became pride. The last message Mara ever sent me said she hoped I found whatever I had been chasing. I stared at those words dozens of times and never answered. Years later, I learned she had moved away after her mother recovered, and eventually I stopped asking mutual acquaintances about her because every answer reopened something I had convinced myself was healed. I met Tessa's mother, Rowan, several years afterward. Rowan was warm, funny, generous, and she understood that loving someone did not mean erasing everyone who came before. She became my wife, and I loved her deeply. When she died, I became so focused on surviving parenthood that the younger version of myself seemed like another person entirely. Mara belonged to that version of me, or so I thought. The next afternoon was painfully bright. I arrived at Brookfield Elementary 10 minutes earlier than usual and parked beneath a tree across from the entrance. I told myself I was simply being punctual. In reality, my heartbeat was behaving like I was 17 again. Parents gathered near the gates as sunlight reflected off windshields. Teachers escorted children toward waiting cars. Then I saw her. Mara stepped through the school doors holding a stack of papers against her chest. For a moment, 13 years collapsed into nothing. She was different, of course. Time had sharpened some things and softened others. Her hair ended just above her shoulders now. Fine lines appeared beside her eyes when she smiled at a student. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years managing rooms full of energetic children. But she still tilted her head slightly when listening. She still pushed loose strands of hair behind her ear when distracted. She still looked like the answer to a question I had spent years refusing to ask. Then her eyes found mine. She stopped walking. The papers in her arms shifted slightly, and one almost slipped free. Neither of us smiled at first. Around us, children shouted goodbye, doors slammed, and somewhere nearby a crossing guard blew a whistle, but Mara and I simply stared across the sunlit walkway like two people standing on opposite ends of a bridge neither had expected to see again. Tessa came racing out seconds later, completely unaware of the tension, and waved excitedly between us. That innocent gesture forced us back into motion. Mara approached slowly. Up close, the years became more visible, but not in a way that diminished her. They made her real. There was maturity in her face now, and something guarded behind her eyes. We exchanged the kind of polite greeting strangers use when they know too much about each other. Tessa looked between us, confused by our awkwardness, then announced that she had forgotten her water bottle inside. Before I could stop her, she disappeared back through the doors, leaving Mara and me alone beneath the afternoon sun. For several seconds neither of us knew where to begin. Eventually, Mara said she hadn't known Tessa was my daughter until she saw the photograph. I told her I hadn't known she worked there. She nodded, looking toward the parking lot instead of at me. There was no anger in her expression, which somehow felt worse. Anger would have been easier. She asked how I had been. I answered with the usual useless word, fine, and then immediately felt ashamed because my wedding ring was gone and anyone who remembered my life could probably guess that fine was complicated. Mara noticed the hesitation. She had always noticed everything. I told her about Rowan. Something changed in Mara's face. The guarded expression disappeared, replaced by genuine sadness. She said she was sorry and asked how long ago it had happened. I told her 5 years. She looked toward the school doors where Tessa had vanished and whispered that Tessa seemed like a remarkable child. I thanked her. For the first time since we'd begun talking, the tension softened. Then Mara told me something I wasn't prepared to hear. She had known about Rowan's death. A former classmate had mentioned it years earlier. Mara had written me a letter afterward but never sent it. She still had it somewhere in a drawer. I felt something twist inside my chest. All those years I had assumed Mara stopped caring the moment we stopped speaking. Apparently, she had been carrying unsent words too. Tessa returned before either of us could continue, proudly holding her water bottle like she had completed a rescue mission. Mara smiled and told her she would see her tomorrow. Then she looked at me and said goodbye in a voice quieter than necessary. For the next few weeks, nothing dramatic happened, and perhaps that was why everything began to matter. Mara remained Tessa's teacher. I remained Tessa's father. We encountered one another during pickup, parent meetings, a Saturday school fundraiser, and once at a local bakery where Tessa insisted on choosing cupcakes for a class celebration. Slowly, awkward greetings became brief conversations. Brief conversations became laughter neither of us expected. I discovered Mara had never married. She had been engaged once in her late 20s but ended it when she realized she was choosing stability rather than love. She didn't say the decision had anything to do with me, and I didn't ask. The real change began during a school art exhibition held on a clear Friday afternoon. Parents crowded the gym while sunlight streamed through tall windows onto rows of children's paintings. Tessa had created a picture titled My Family. It showed herself in the center, me on one side, and a large yellow sun above us. There was also a woman drawn near the edge of the page. I assumed it represented Rowan until I noticed the dark shoulder-length hair and the little red book painted in her hand. Mara always carried red notebooks at school. I asked Tessa who the woman was. She looked at me as though the answer were obvious. She said it was Ms. Voss because family could include people who helped your heart feel safe. I couldn't speak. Later, I found Mara standing alone beside the classroom windows after most families had gone. The afternoon sun painted long rectangles across the floor. I told her what Tessa had said. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she looked away before they fell. Then, after 13 years of avoidance, we finally spoke about what happened between us. Not politely. Not carefully. Truthfully. I admitted that leaving had not been wrong, but the way I left had been. I had been terrified that choosing love meant sacrificing ambition, so I turned Mara into the villain of a decision that frightened me. Mara admitted that she had punished me with silence because she wanted me to prove I would fight for us. When I didn't, she convinced herself I never truly loved her. We had spent 13 years protecting ourselves from conclusions neither of us had ever confirmed. I apologized first. It wasn't a grand speech. It was simply an acknowledgement that I had hurt someone who had trusted me, and that becoming older had shown me how careless young pride could be. Mara cried then, quietly. She apologized too, not for having expectations, but for believing I should somehow understand them without conversation. There was no dramatic kiss. No instant reunion. Real life rarely repairs 13 years in one afternoon. Instead, we began again. Mara occasionally joined Tessa and me for weekend lunches. Sometimes we walked through the park after school. She helped Tessa practice spelling words while I pretended not to notice how easily she fit into our kitchen. I learned that Mara still hated crowded restaurants, still rescued injured animals, and still folded page corners despite owning several bookmarks. She learned I had become slightly better at pancakes. Months passed. One spring Saturday, almost a year after Tessa first told me her teacher knew me, the three of us attended a community festival downtown. It was midday, warm and bright, with food stalls lining the streets and children running beneath colorful banners. Tessa walked between us eating strawberry ice cream. At some point, without thinking, she reached for Mara's hand with one hand and mine with the other. Mara looked down at her. Then she looked at me. There are moments in life that announce themselves loudly, and others that whisper. That moment whispered. I realized I wasn't looking at the girl I had loved at 23. I was looking at the woman she had become, standing beside the child who had unknowingly brought us back into each other's lives. Later that afternoon, while Tessa played at a nearby fountain, Mara and I sat on a bench beneath blooming trees. I told her I didn't want to pretend what was happening between us was only friendship anymore. Her eyes filled with that same expression I remembered from years ago, equal parts courage and fear. She said she didn't want to pretend either. We moved slowly after that. Carefully. Not because love was weaker the second time, but because we understood its value better. Mara never tried to replace Rowan, and I never wanted her to. She helped Tessa preserve her mother's memory, even creating a small scrapbook with photographs and handwritten stories about Rowan gathered from family members. That single gesture removed the final wall around my heart. Mara wasn't asking us to forget the life we had lost. She was simply willing to build something beside it. 2 years after that first school pickup, on another bright afternoon, we returned to the sycamore tree behind our old high school. The school had changed, but the tree somehow hadn't. Tessa came with us, complaining dramatically about how boring it was to hear stories about ancient teenage history. I carried a small ring in my pocket. I asked Mara to marry me beneath the same branches where we had first become friends. She cried before I finished asking. Tessa cried too, although she later insisted it was because pollen had gotten into her eyes. And I remember standing there beneath that enormous tree, sunlight falling through the leaves, realizing that second chances do not erase the first ending. They do not return lost years. They do not magically remove grief, regret, or mistakes. They simply give us the chance to write something different with whatever time remains. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes that life can surprise us, and subscribe to Lifeline Vibes. And if you've ever had someone return to your life when you least expected it, tell us about it in the comments. Sometimes another person's story is exactly what someone else needs to hear. Special request: comment second chances matter if you believe some people come back into our lives for a reason. Years later, whenever people asked Mara and me how we found each other again after so much time, we never gave them a complicated answer. We simply looked toward Tessa. Because the truth was beautifully simple. For 13 years, Mara and I had believed our story was over. Then one sunny afternoon, my daughter climbed into my car, dropped her backpack onto the floor, and said 5 words that changed all 3 of our lives. My teacher knows you, Dad. If you'd like, I can also make this story more suspenseful, more romantic, or even more emotional for higher YouTube retention.